Welcome back to Zenith Poker. In today's video, we'll be covering the 3 key principles for multi-way pots. So the first principle that we have is the principle that bluff catching is shared. All players facing a bet in a multi-way pot share the burden of the defense against bluffs. When you're defending, the folding frequencies of each of the players is multiplicative, which means that the folding frequencies multiply together to get the total folding frequency. So if collectively the defenders are trying to prevent bluffs from realizing any EV or making the EV of a bluff precisely 0, then the defenders will fold in total at alpha. However, this means that each individual player will have to fold more than alpha. So for n defenders against the bet, the product of each player's folding frequency will end up being alpha in order to make the expected value of bluffing exactly 0. But this means that each individual player will actually be folding a lot more than alpha. And so what we can do is we can calculate the average folding frequency and use that as a guide moving forward. So the average folding frequency, in order to make the EV of bluffing precisely 0, is equal to the nth root of alpha, or the nth root of the bet size divided by 1 plus the bet size. In order to understand what this equation means, we can graph it against the bet size. So here we've got 5 different curves, and each of these curves represents the average folding frequency against a bet for the number of defenders n through 1 to n through from n equals 1 through to n equals 5. So this grey curve is the folding frequency for one defender. So it's the folding frequency for a heads up pot in order to make bluffing, the EV of bluffing, precisely 0. In other words, this curve for n equals 1 is just alpha. But these curves here for n equals 2, n equals 3, n equals 4, and n equals 5 are the respective roots of alpha. So for n equals 2, that means that there's 2 defenders. Say for example, you're in a multi-way pot with 3 players. One of the players has made a bet, and now we want to calculate the average folding frequency for each of the other 2 players. And so for example, with the bet size of 1, so betting exactly the size of the pot, the folding frequency in a heads up pot to make that bluffing hand have an EV of exactly 0 is 0.5. So alpha of the bet s equals 1 is 1/2, or 0.5. So you would fold half of the time in order to make a bluff exactly 0 in EV. But when there's 2 defenders of the pot, that increases significantly to up to above 0.7. It's in fact 1 over the square root of 2. And then the third root of 2, fourth root of 2, fifth root of 2, for n equals 3, 4, and 5. So you're folding significantly more when there's more players in the pot. So for the same bet size, each player needs to fold significantly more than if the pot had fewer players. With each additional player, the folding frequency increases dramatically. And this is even more pronounced when the bet size is relatively small. So say for example, the betting player is betting 1/5 of the pot. So if they're betting 1/5 of the pot, that bet size will be 0.2, and alpha against 0.2 will be 1/6, so 0.1667, so 16.7%. But as soon as you add another player to the pot, that folding frequency, in fact, more than doubles just by adding an extra player. And so for the smaller bet sizes sort of less than the pot, there's a massive increase in the folding frequency when you add more players into the pot. So in multi-way pots, individual players will fold a lot more against bets than the equivalent in a heads-up pot. One of the shortcuts that you can use in game is if you can consider the bet and you actually multiply that by the number of players, that will roughly approximate the bet's polarity in the heads-up pot. So for example, if you face a 75% pot bet, a 3/4 pot bet, and there's 4 defenders and you're one of those 4 defenders, in order to sort of convert that to the heads-up pot, you just multiply that bet by 4. So you're multiplying the 3/4 pot by 4, that gives you a 3 times pot bet. So in other words, in the heads-up pot, that would be sort of equivalent for the betting player to bet 3 times the pot. You might think that this is a bit extreme, but in fact, if you do the numbers, this shortcut of multiplying the bet by the number of defenders actually underestimates how often you should fold. So you should even fold more often than that bet. So in that previous example where there's 4 defenders and that player bets 3/4 of the pot, if you can consider that bet in the heads-up pot to be essentially 3 times the pot, that would actually underestimate how often you should fold on average in the multi-way pot. Okay, so the next principle is to value the chips in your stack. The reason behind this principle is that it's much more important to respect your own chips in multi-way pots, because the pot in the middle is actually harder to win. When there's more players defending the pot, or more players in the pot trying to contest the pot is simply harder to win. So your own chips behind you are going to be relatively more valuable than the chips in the middle. So to demonstrate this, I want you to consider what it means to actually bluff catch when there's a player behind you. So you may be able to bluff catch against the betting player's range. In other words, your hand beats all the bluffs in the betting player's range, but loses to the value component of the betting player's range. That would make your hand a pure bluff catcher. However, when there's a defender left to act, there's a player to your left still left to act, that means that the player to your left hasn't revealed any extra information about the strength of their hand, and so they might actually have a hand strong enough to call as well, or even raise on top of your call. If you are sitting there in the middle with a pure bluff catcher, hand that beats the betting player's bluffs but loses to the betting player's value hands, this means that you can't actually ever call, because in the heads-up pot you might be able to call and have an EV of 0, but because there's an extra player behind you left to act, this means that your EV in the multi-way pot would be less than 0 to call, because calling sometimes will lose to the player that hasn't acted yet. If you're not last to act in the multi-way pot and you're facing a bet, you should be quite cautious about putting your chips into the middle. The way to do it is to call with your very strongest bluff catchers that you think can beat some of the value range, and some of the strongest draws to the nuts. The next situation to consider is when you're facing a bet and a call. So you might be last to act in this situation, but if there's a bet and a call in front of you, that means that the player in the middle has quite a strong hand, because they should have realized that with you being left to act, they can't really call any pure bluff catchers. So that means that the defending player in the middle has a relatively strong hand, and on earlier streets, and even sometimes on the river, this player might have a hand that will intend to back raise over your squeeze, or donk out on the next street. When you're deciding to overcall against a bet and a call, or you're trying to squeeze multiple players in the multi-way pot, you should be quite cautious of which hands the earlier callers might have. Because now your hand not only has to beat the bluffs of the betting player, but they also have to beat the calling range, or be ahead of the calling range of the first caller, who naturally, because they're in the middle, has a very tight calling range. And the last situation I want you to consider is when you're actually making a bet yourself. So the first thing you should think about is the strength of your hand. And it might be more profitable with a strong hand to actually check and then raise rather than bet out yourself. Especially if there's weaker players left to act behind you, and those players are quite likely to open the pot again by betting themselves. So if you've got a very strong hand, a very nutted hand, and you're considering whether to bet or to check, in the multi-way pot, if you're in an early position, you should seriously consider checking and letting the players behind you bet for you, and you can go for the check raise. And now let's consider the situation where you've got a relatively middling hand. Betting big with a middle strength hand will often shrink the continuing ranges of all the remaining players very quickly, meaning that you end up just isolating yourself against stronger hands or very nutted draws. So when you've got a middling hand and you kind of want to deny equity, you should seriously consider just betting relatively small and using the fact that the pot is multi-way to get the folds that you need. The other thing that you can do with the middling hands is try to actually win at showdown. You might not be able to win at showdown very often, but in the situations where you check and the remaining players check behind, your hand will be relatively strong because the remaining players will often not have a strong hand after they check through, say, on the flop or the turn. So with the middle strength hands, it might be better to either bet small or delay your betting to the next street in order to get more information about the remaining players' hands. And lastly, if you're drawing to the nuts or you've got a relatively strong draw, it might actually be more appropriate in a multi-way pot to keep the pot small relative to the stack by playing passively and calling bets rather than playing aggressively and raising over multiple players. This means that when you actually make your draw and the pot is still multi-way or the pot is relatively small, you can value bet on the later street and get value that way rather than trying to get folds by making a bet or a raise yourself. The third key principle for multi-way pots is that the positional advantage is magnified. So since there are more players left to act, each additional position has more information about the previously acted players. And on the other hand, in earlier position, you know much less and you need to play more passively in order to get extra information without risking the chips in your stack. Additionally, being in absolute position means that you're guaranteed to be in position on the next street when you're overcalling. And this informational advantage for being in position compounds over multiple streets of betting. As we discussed earlier, the player that is last to act when facing a bet will have the widest bluff catching range. But if you're in late position or in absolute position in the multi-way pot, you might be able to construct a calling range to force the early position players out of the pot. And you do this by using your positional advantage on the next street. So you can construct your calling range on, say, for example, the button in a multi-way pot by using various nutted hands, some strong bluff catchers, and some strong draws. And then you would use these hands, especially the nutted hands, to defend against squeezes on the current street, and you can bet into the remaining opponents on the next street when they check to you. On the flop and on the turn, if you're in position in the multi-way pot and you're facing a bet, you can actually call many more hands than you would otherwise be able to because you can use your positional advantage on the next street. And this calling range often will force the out of position players who are left to act behind you to exit the pot early because they know that they can't overcall. Your range is relatively tight, and they'll also be out of position against multiple players on the next street. Okay, so that concludes this video on multi-way pots. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye now.